I'm Chris Lee, joined by Blake Lovell today as we break down some SEC hoops. Blake, we're almost a month into the season. Lots of stuff going on. Alabama with a big win this weekend. But first of all, let me just get your overall impression on SEC hoops as we are about a month into the season.
Yeah, I mean, it's in an interesting spot because I think there are several teams that probably feel like they should be sitting a little bit better than they are, although I think you're still looking at a pretty good top seven. I think, great top seven, maybe change a little bit after a couple recent games, and still have some probably questions about a couple teams in particular. But I mean, the top four, maybe top five right now, I think are Final Four caliber type teams. That's obviously can't say that until you get a tournament bracket and all that stuff. But I mean, that's just kind of the way it's set up right now. And I don't think the top four in the order probably that I have them in is what I would have expected, a month into the season. And so I think there are several potential great teams. I think there are maybe three teams in the middle that still have some stuff to prove. And then beyond that, it's anyone's guess how I think the bottom. And I kind of thought this going into the season, the bottom, the SEC could be a little rough, especially those top four or those bottom four teams or so. I don't think we've seen maybe the progress we thought we would from a couple of those teams. But overall, I mean, you've got, like I said, several teams I think that could be great. And that's kind of where things sit right now.
Okay, Ken Pomeroy this morning, Monday morning, has got in order nationally within the SEC, Tennessee at 11, Tennessee 10, Alabama 11, Auburn 12, LSU 13, and then Kentucky a little bit further down at 21, Florida at 28, Arkansas at 34. We looked at this as maybe kind of a 6-team top half of the league. That's kind of in line with what Ken Pom thinks at this point, but I think we thought the top four in some order, probably Tennessee, Alabama, Auburn, and Kentucky. Ken Pom would now edge out Kentucky and throw in LSU. Do you agree or disagree with the way he's got his ranking structured? And I know I say it's a computer ranking, right? It's not like he sits there and says, I think this team is better than another. But that aside, where do you think Ken Pom's got it right? Where do you think it's got it wrong?
Yeah, I mean, as we always say, it's just one set of data. I think there's so much more that goes into it, and that's what we always talk about when we talk about Ken Pom. And I've said it too. I mean, it's still, I think, in the adjustment phase of you're still adding data. We're, barely just now getting to double digits games for some teams. And so I think there's still probably another month or so before you get a real good feel on where things are with that. I mean, I just tell you straight up, I've got Alabama at 1, I've got Auburn at 2, got LSU at 3, Tennessee at 4. And I got Kentucky at 5. So that's where, things are at right now. I mean, again, you can mix and match a couple of these. I mean, I think Alabama's the clear number 1. Like you said, they beat Houston, they beat Gonzaga. Now they have a really good chance to go in and throttle a struggling Memphis team, which that could get ugly based on how Memphis has been playing. And then, I mean, Auburn, look, they're doing this without Allen Flanigan and, the whole 2-game suspension and all this for Bruce Pearl. Who cares? I mean, it's, they were going to probably beat Nebraska no matter what, but they came out and just drilled them by 30-something, I think. And LSU still undefeated. They beat Georgia Tech. Didn't look great early, but they win by 16, and here they are. I think all but one of their games they've won by 15 or more. The best defensive team easily that Will Wade's had there. They're one of the best defensive teams in the country, which I just completely stunned by. I would have never expected that from LSU, but he has clearly got them exactly where he wants them on that side. It just took a little while to get there. Tennessee, I mean, Tennessee's going to be a little up and down, I think, and I think that's probably the best way to put it with them is I think you look at Tennessee, and I've said it before, as they go, it's going to be about Kennedy Chandler. Like if he plays well, I think Tennessee will be able to beat anyone. If he doesn't, I think they could struggle. And so that makes me a little hesitant on them. So that's kind of where they're at right now. I think Kentucky, everyone has probably been, I know what I've said about Kentucky. I said that even though they hadn't played anyone, I still think that they're pretty good. But one of the things that we clearly saw against Notre Dame is, we came into the season thinking this was going to be that shooting team that he had needed there, John Calipari. But, when C.J. Frederick out for the year. That takes away one of those shooting elements. And then when they just have an off night, they're going to really struggle from the perimeter. And so that was disappointing. I think Kentucky, and it doesn't get any easier now with Ohio State next. So I'm curious to see what we get from teams like Tennessee and Kentucky maybe over the next couple of weeks, just to kind of see where things kind of fall out with that. But I mean, right now those top three, they're looking pretty good.
Well, let's talk Alabama for a minute. You mentioned the wins over Gonzaga and Houston. I don't know that a program in the country has got two better wins than Alabama does. Bama's only loss is to Iona, which is a Rick Pitino coach team and a very good mid-major team most years. But I think the thing that sticks out to me, and it's not a surprise, but they're balanced. Their rotation goes 8 deep. They're all contributing a lot. We talked about J.D. Davison, what an impact he would have. He basically won the game for them in the last minute. You've got Shackelford and Quinterly doing things. I would say Quinterly is looking like our preseason player of the year pick, might be dead on there. But what are your general thoughts on the way they've played and that rotation in general? Which, by the way, we talked about Charles Bediako being a key for them in the middle. He's playing well too.
Yeah, quite frankly, they're kind of what we expected them to be. I think that's kind of what it's come down to with them. I mean, they have, their backcourt's as good as anyone's in the country with those three leading the way, Shackelford, Quinterly, and Davison. I mean, that's kind of what we thought they could potentially get to. And like we talked about too, going into the season, I mean, they just have more size in the paint, with Bediako and those guys. I mean, that can alleviate a lot of problems when you're able to have someone like that, be able to play the way he can play. But still, I mean, everything's going to go through their guards, and you've got other guys, like Juwan Gary and Keon Ellis and those types of guys that we knew were going to have a big role. They played well. And yeah, I mean, it's just one of those teams that they're just not easy to prepare for. And like you said, I mean, you just go up and down the line. I mean, the depth is there. We talked about how 3-point shooting wise, when they get going, they're really hard to stop. And it's just, I don't know how you prepare for them with how they can shoot sometimes. So they are yet again. I mean, I feel like we're saying this for the second straight year, but like they're Final Four good, and they're the team to beat in the SEC right now. And there's no one that I'm aware of that has a better pair of wins than those two right there. When it comes to Gonzaga and Houston, I mean, those are two Final Four type teams too, and Alabama's beaten both of them, back to back now in the span of a week. So good spot to be in if you're the Tide here heading into this stretch where they're going to get Memphis and Colorado State's in there too. Those are Memphis is struggling, but Colorado State's a pretty good team. So.
Then you go down the road to Auburn, and of course we had the Bruce Pearl news last week, which is kind of no news at this point. He got suspended for 2 games, and who cares at this point? You've got, though, Jabari Smith was one of the freshmen that we circled as one of the big-time players in this league potentially, and he's starting to get conversation as 1 overall for next year's draft. He's averaging about 17 and 7. He's getting steals. They've got Walker Kessler side him, who's not putting up big numbers, but has had some big moments for them. KD Johnson has come through. Wendell Green Jr., the transfer from Eastern Kentucky, is really doing a good job of running that offense. And remember, this team still doesn't have Alan Flanagan, Blake, who I presume will be back soon.
Yeah, I mean, once he gets back there, he's their best returning player. You can word it however you want to word it. I mean, he may wind up being their best player. I mean, I think Jabari Smith's probably got that, settled at this point just based on how good he is. But, I mean, yeah, once they add Alan Flanagan back into the mix, like this is going to be, I mean, they may be better than Alabama at that point. I'm not sure. Like, I think that this is where, like, I said this to someone during the summer that I thought there was a good chance coming into the season that Alabama and Auburn were going to be 1-2. In what order, I wasn't sure, just because, we had a lot to see how things played out. And, you had to see how certain guys clicked and the chemistry and all that. But, I mean, once they get Flanagan back, like they're going to be hard to beat. And, I mean, that's just kind of what we've expected from this team. And remember, I mean, they're a double overtime, best game of the season loss against UConn. Away from still being unbeaten right now. And I think that they have just looked very good, very impressive. They're taking care of the ball. They're good on both sides of the floor, which that's always a nice thing. And this is still a team that doesn't have a ton of experience. I mean, that's something that maybe as you go along the season, maybe that factors in. I just don't think so. I think that they are just so talented and everything's kind of meshing together pretty well. And once they get Flanagan back, I mean, their depth, I think, will be able to compete with an Alabama. So these two teams at the top, they have been so impressive. And like you said, I mean, Auburn's doing it without probably one of their top three players, if not best player, when you look at Flanagan not being on the floor.
You mentioned LSU's defense. You look at the KenPom number, and seeing LSU number 3 in the country in defense is just astounding. Last year, that was an offense-oriented team. Most of the kids on that team are gone. I don't know that you'll find a team in the country that just looks much differently in terms of style than it did last year, any more so than LSU.
No, I mean, again, it's they have not. I mean, we've talked about it over the years. I mean, it's just the one thing that held this team back, where they were top 5 offensive team the past couple of seasons, was their defense. And I mean, it wasn't even close. Like, they were not an average defensive team. Like, they just weren't a good defensive team. And that was something that they could outscore teams just because they had that ability, because they just had so many good offensive players. But now they've got a good offensive team. It's not a great offensive team like the ones we've seen in recent seasons, but that was to be expected. However, we could not have expected this team to just completely flip and, again, be an elite defensive team the way that they have. And yeah, I mean, it's something to watch them play. And we said that. I mean, even I think when Will Wade was hired there, I mean, one of the reasons he was hired was because, you look at what he was able to accomplish at VCU, and you knew kind of what you're getting from a stylistic standpoint with, the Shaka Smart coaching tree and how they want to play defense, but it just never seemed to click, really. I mean, they were a decent defensive team. I mean, they were better than they were in recent years. That year that they had Tremont Waters and all that, they got the Sweet 16. Was that 2018-19, I think? But nothing like this. Like, this is on another level. And I know I've seen some people, and I'm flabbergasted by this. Like, LSU's not played a bad schedule at all. They played some pretty solid teams, and really, outside of a couple games, most of the teams they played are going to at least have a shot at, feeling like they could potentially factor in some way, even if it's an NIT, NCAA bubble type scenario, maybe. So it's not like they're playing just a complete bottom tier to this point. And I think that's what, again, is probably most impressive when you look at what they've been able to do. They have not allowed anyone. I mean, they haven't allowed more than 61 points this season. I mean, that is through 9 games. Again, not playing just a awful, terrible schedule. To not allow anyone, or actually I think they allowed 63 against Penn State, but that's it. I mean, 63 points, that's the most you've allowed through 9 games. That is something, like I said, even with not playing just a terrible schedule. And I mean, this is a pretty young team too, when you look at kind of everyone that's factored in and having to play some underclassmen. So yeah, they've been the surprise of the season, no doubt.
Yeah, they have not played like a surefire NCAA tournament team, but they played some teams like Belmont, Wake Forest, Ohio, which might be better than the KenPom rating. Ohio's had a good win or two this year. Really controlled Georgia Tech. I think that game was in Atlanta this weekend. Yeah, I'd forgotten about Liberty, which is always one of those 13 seeds you don't want to play. So, yeah, I mean, they have really not played, other than a couple games, maybe Louisiana Monroe, and McNeese State, haven't played a lot of bad teams. They're not playing, the Gonzagas and the Houstons and those kind of teams yet.
Yeah, but they're beating the teams they should beat, and we can't say that for a couple of SEC teams, unfortunately. So.
Yeah, well, you can't say that. I mean, even Alabama, as good as Alabama's win, shouldn't have lost to Iona. Now, again, We've said what we've said about them, but what do you make of Tennessee? That's just been sort of an up and down team. I think you nailed it in your earlier assessment, but let's dive into the Vols a little bit more here.
I mean, I think it's pretty simple. I mean, I think it's, if Kennedy Chandler scores double figures, they'll have a chance to win. If he doesn't, they're not going to beat anyone. And I'm not saying that, in a way that's demeaning. It's just, that's it. Like, I think that's kind of what it's going to come down to. He had 9 points against Texas Tech. They lost and just played ugly. That's just kind of one of those games. You go back to that game against Villanova, I think he struggled on that too. I have to look back at it. He had 6 points against Villanova. So I just think that's it. I mean, he is everything for them, and that's not knocking everyone else. And when you actually look at the numbers, defensively, we always say it, they're going to be good enough. I mean, right now they're number 1 in KenPom in defense, and it's like they're going to be good enough defensively to probably beat anyone. But they've just got to have that consistency on offense, and we've seen that kind of go up and down I think over the past, little while here. Now, certainly they come back and beat UNC Greensboro by 40, but I just think it's going to be a situation where if Kennedy Chandler as a freshman, he had 9 points against Greensboro too, but he was a lot more active in terms of finding guys and had a lot more assists and those kind of things. I think as he goes, they're going to go, and that's really what it comes down to. Now they've had other guys step up. I mean, Vescovi's played pretty well. When you look up and down his line, he's been pretty consistent this season, which I know they wanted more out of. He's controlled his turnovers. You don't have as many of those because he's not having to handle the ball as much. But I think that's it. I mean, I think everyone else, that there's still, a lot to be determined on the consistency offensive wise of everyone else on the floor. But if Kennedy Chandler's playing well, I think they got a chance to beat anyone just because they're going to be good enough defensively to have that ability to do so.
Kentucky, don't know what to make of this team yet. And you mentioned some of the things that I'd been thinking, but I don't know. The Cats still haven't beaten a good team yet. Now, we'll see more. They'll run the Ohio State, Louisville gauntlet before we get into conference play. But I think you're right. I mean, I think that most of us thought that Kellen Grady would really step up and be a big gun for them, but it just hasn't happened so far.
Yeah, I am, I've seen a lot of people just jump off the Kentucky bandwagon after one loss, saying they're not even probably not even going to be a top half SEC team. I think that's just ludicrous at this point. Because again, I said going to this Notre Dame game, I said this to someone last week, I would not be surprised Kentucky lost this game because it's a true road game. It's their first true road game of the year. Notre Dame, I mean, Mike Bray, I've always said, is one of the most underrated coaches in the country. And when you've still got, I mean, this is still, nothing's changed on Kentucky. Like, this is still a young team. Not as young as they have been, but they're still a pretty young team, an inexperienced team who doesn't have hardly any chemistry together. And I think it's with Kentucky, I've just gotten to the point where it's like, this isn't the John Wall teams where they're just going to run through everybody in the non-conference schedule. They're going to lose a couple of these games each year. And I think that's just kind of the norm now with this team. And it is what it is. I think come mid-January, if they play the way they did, against Notre Dame, if they're doing that in mid-January, then I think we've got a lot more issues for Kentucky. And maybe that is what we'll be talking about. Maybe they will lose against Ohio State. They'll lose to Louisville, and all of a sudden you're looking at a 3-game losing streak. Then you've got serious questions. But I just, I look at the history, and the history tells me that usually John Calipari is going to have it figured out by the time they get to late January and early February. And as we know, I mean, that's, March is what matters. And even if this Kentucky team that's just not as dominant as, maybe I expect them to be this early, although I had them at number 1 going the season, but I can't say that I thought this was going to be, be comparing to those John Wall, Anthony Davis type teams. It's just, it's a completely different setup. But that's where I said, not having CJ Frederick, I think there's another shooter that you take out of the lineup. And then you mentioned Grady. I mean, he's had his struggle. So I am still going to reserve judgment on Kentucky. I don't think they're again, I don't no longer think they're the best team in the SEC or anything, but I'm not quite jumping off to say that, I think this is just going to be a bad team or anything just yet.
What do we think of the Mississippis? I was surprised that Ole Miss just got the brakes beat off it the way it did by Western this weekend. Really, Ole Miss never in that game. Mississippi State is the team that we have thought had a chance based on some returning experience to climb a notch, but they're kind of still stuck where they were. I had a loss to Colorado State this last weekend, although that's not a bad loss at all. It was close, and I think that one was on the road too. But what do we make of the teams in the Magnolia State right now?
Mississippi State's kind of where I thought they'd be. I thought several of these games were toss-ups for them in the non-conference portion. I think the one against Louisville is the one maybe you look back at and feel like they just should have played a little bit better in that one. I mean, certainly the home loss to Minnesota, they want that one back. Colorado State, I think, is going to wind up being a top 20-ish team by the time the end of the season rolls around. I mean, they're 10-0 right now. I think they're that good. So I don't think they'll look back at this loss as a bad one, although, again, it's another close loss. With that, they're going to be kind of where I thought they'd be. They'll probably be the 7th or 8th best team in the SEC. I don't know. I think I said, their ceiling may be like a number 5 in the SEC, something like that for this team. And that's kind of what they look like to this point. I don't think they're going to be, I think they're going to be one of those teams, if they make it to the NCAA tournament, like they'll be a 10, 11, somewhere in there. That just kind of is the look of this team, I think, just with how they're built and how it's played out thus far. Ole Miss, yeah, I mean, there's no other way to put it. That's a disappointing loss to beat Memphis, which and Memphis is just a mess right now. But to win that game, have a little bit of confidence, and then just come back and lose by 23 to Western Kentucky. I mean, we've said it. Western Kentucky's not a bad team at all, but you can't be losing by 23 in a game like that. So Ole Miss is, any potential probably we looked at them of having that chance to move up into that top tier. I think we picked them probably 9th or 10th going into the season. That's kind of where they still are. I don't think the whole lot's changed, but they've left some opportunities, I think, on the table with that game against Western Kentucky. Even that one earlier in the season against Marquette. They've had their opportunities. They just haven't been able to capitalize on them.
Arkansas has not played a great schedule. I mean, it's got wins over Kansas State and Cincinnati, which might be NIT type teams, but they just looked awful this weekend against Oklahoma.
I've been lower on Arkansas.
You've called this one for a while. You saw something coming that I think the world didn't see. So what is it exactly?
Yeah, I just don't. I don't know. Like this team, I feel like this team is just missing that. I mean, I'm not going to say Moses Moody or, I'm not going to say that because I don't think that's fair. Everyone's missing Moses Moody. That's not a player that comes around every single year. But even like a Justin Smith, that's another guy that we always talked about how he got his recognition towards the end of the year, but just was undervalued, I think, in terms of really what all he could do. I just don't know that this team has. First of all, I don't think they have the depth. I think that's pretty clear at this point. But I just don't think they have that it factor, and there's just something missing. And I don't, obviously I don't know what that something is yet. I think you just kind of sense it though, even with them starting 9-0. That's what I always kept saying. Like I still feel like there's just something missing with them. And against Oklahoma, I mean, this is not a great shooting team. Maybe that's part of it. I mean, they're not shooting well from three at all this season. That's always an element, that can be very helpful. But for the most part, I still just look at the team as sort of a mixture of talent that has been able to get by, I think, against, competition that's not as good. But now when you have a game like you have against Oklahoma, maybe it is going to be an opportunity, I think, for Eric Musselman and company to really go back to the drawing board and maybe find what that is. What are they going to need against some of these upper tier teams? And I texted you this after that game. The thing is, Arkansas, quite honestly, could very well be 14 or 15-1 heading into mid-January, because if you look at their upcoming schedule, they got Hofstra, Elon, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, Texas A&M, and Missouri. So those first four to start their SEC slate against Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, A&M, and Missouri, those are all winnable games. Two of those are on the road at State and at A&M. But, I mean, they could win those games realistically, because I think, again, you're looking at teams in there that are going to be bottom half teams in the league. But you look at that back half of their schedule, and maybe that is the perfect setup for them, because this is a team that's still trying to figure it out. But when you look at like the last probably, 8 games or so of their SEC slate, Auburn, Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, Kentucky, LSU, Tennessee again. They've got Missouri in the middle of that. I mean, that is a strong back half of the SEC, and who knows where those teams are at that point. But if you just look at it on paper, it sets up in an interesting way for them, because maybe it actually works out better that the front half of their SEC schedule is very manageable. Maybe they figure some of those things out by the time they get to that back half, that I would just venture to say right now, without looking at anyone else's schedule, I can't imagine anyone has a tougher final 8 games or so in the league.
It's just fallen off a cliff for Florida lately. I don't know that it's fair a month in to say a team is this or that, because that's really not how most teams are. But you definitely have a case of two entirely different teams. I mean, Florida just destroys Florida State about a month ago and then gets a really good win over Ohio State on the neutral floor, but gets beat by Oklahoma December 1st, and then that loss to Texas Southern that just was out of the blue to an 0-7 team, and they were down 20 late in that game before losing by 15. loses to Maryland this weekend. What do we think the real Florida is here, Blake?
I think they're exactly what you're seeing. I think it's just a team that is inconsistent, and that was the fear, I think, going into the season. And I mean, it's Maryland was due, I think, because they lost. I mean, majority of their games have been close losses, so they were due to win a game. And I don't want to put too much into that with Florida, but I think now it gets to that point to where it starts to become mental, and especially after that Texas Southern loss. Now you've lost 3 of 4. You were a top 10 caliber team before that, and now it's I mean, I think it's a very similar situation. You talk about schedules. I mean, they're going to open at Ole Miss and SEC play, but then it's Alabama, Auburn, and LSU right after that, our top 3 teams right now. So I think we figure out a lot about Florida over the next month or so. I just, that's the thing, is like, even when they play a South Florida and a Stony Brook, like they're going to play next, it's going to be in the back of your head that this is still the team that lost to Texas Southern by 15 at home, and a team that hadn't won a game all season. So that, I think, is something that's going to stick with you with this team. And when they get in these close games, that trust factor is just not there anymore. And really, they won that close game against Ohio State, but beyond that, most of their games have been blowouts. And now it's like, when they get in these close games, do you feel like you're going to be able to trust them against quality teams? They do have that reference point of beating Ohio State in that scenario, but I think we've kind of figured it out. Like, this is just, the inconsistency is back, and it's not good for this team. And I am curious to see. I mean, certainly they should rebound with 2 straight wins here, and probably in convincing fashion. But I don't know that that's going to change my opinion a whole lot about Florida until I see what they do from January 5th to January 12th when they play Bama, Auburn, and LSU.
Some folks saw A&M as a little bit of a sleeper team. I don't know that you and I were on board with that, but that's a really balanced team. I think beating TCU in a game that they had a chance to win down the stretch would have moved the needle a little bit, but it didn't happen. But that's a team that's got a lot of guys who can contribute, and Ken Pom loves them right now. He's got them, I think, 64 this morning. So I don't know what to think of them just because of body of work so far. They have got some good wins. They did get Notre Dame, lost to Wisconsin, but I'm still trying to figure out, like, who are these guys? Because you look at that roster and it's just a bunch of names that aren't really familiar to SEC fans.
Yeah, I think it's wait and see on A&M. I know they've beaten Butler and Notre Dame, which Kentucky couldn't do, but that's a different scenario because one's a true road game, one's not. I still think it's sort of just wait and see on A&M because I'm not sure exactly where they're going to factor into the mix. Because we're not going to learn a whole lot. Actually, we could learn a whole lot from them over the next couple games. Tulane and Oregon State. I mean, those are games you feel like A&M should win, but they're probably 2 games though that will also perhaps be close. And can they win games like that? I just don't. I don't have a fully formed opinion on A&M yet. I think it's too early to figure that out completely. As you said, I mean, they've had some opportunities. That game against TCU would have been nice to have, but they haven't played bad at all, and they have won that game against Notre Dame and some of those others. So I think you see the positives. Haven't seen a whole lot of negatives from them yet, aside from the free throw shooting. They're a terrible free throw shooting team, but other than that, I mean, I don't. A&M's about what I thought they'd be probably at this point in the season. They have been a little bit of a surprise, but at the same time, they've been a surprise through 9 games. I don't know though if we expect that surprise to continue, through 15, 20, 25 games. So I think it's wait and see on them.
Yeah, if Florida's the hardest team in the league to figure out, South Carolina would be, I think, 1B, because let's look at this. I remember watching that loss to Princeton, second game of the season, looked awful. They just get blown off the floor in their own, I guess that was an away game against Coastal Carolina by 24 points a couple weeks ago. But in between, beat UAB back on November the 19th and snuck up and popped Florida State by a point this weekend. Really, this has just been typical for Frank Martin's teams. It almost seems like ever since that Final Four year. You cannot get a grasp on where they are at a given moment.
No, and I think that'll be the way it is all season long. I don't think that's going to change. They're not good on offense. and that's why I think that you have the sporadic play that you get. Sometimes they can just make these runs. Sometimes they can't score, like the game against Coastal Carolina. Um, I mean it's you said it best. Like I don't think it's going to be unlike many teams we've seen from Frank Martin, where it's one game you're going to think that maybe they're starting to make their run. Another game, maybe this game against Allen. I don't know who Allen is. Allen University, Allen College. They're going to play on Tuesday. I mean, are we 100% certain we feel like they're going to win that game? Ken Palm's 100% certain, but I've seen these games before with South Carolina where it's just like you never know. But all kidding aside, I just think that they're at least playing well. I think on the defensive side, that's giving them a chance because they do have a team that's, you kind of look at the makeup of them. I mean, they've got a pretty good group here, I think, of talent, and they've got some decent size. But South Carolina's, right now, I mean, they're not a team that you really expect to make a huge jump. Even though, I mean, look, beating Florida State, even that UAB game, I think was a nice win for them early in the season, and they beat Western Kentucky, like we said, just they're all an Ole Miss. So they're going to be very up and down. Inconsistency, I think, could be the theme for them. But beyond that, I don't think we get a good read on South Carolina, maybe throughout the entire season, because I just think that they could be pretty up and down.
Yeah, you're right. Allen, I don't know who that is. Is that Ray Allen? Is that Allen Iverson? Are we going first name or last name here?
South Carolina lose a game a couple years ago to I don't remember. I feel like that was several years ago. They lost to a team, maybe that was like an exhibition game or something. I can't remember. But some of those games we've seen before with them, and they just seem to have some of those sometimes. I don't think they're losing to Allen, but you never know, I suppose.
I guess the only three teams we haven't discussed, Vandy, Georgia, Missouri. Georgia has popped up and shocked Memphis, although I think that one's lost some luster since it happened, given Memphis's slide. Vanderbilt hasn't really beaten a good team all year. It's without two of its best players. Don't know when those guys are coming back. The Commodores, I've seen a lot here in Nashville, just looked awful lately. And Missouri just got destroyed by Kansas over the weekend. Lost to, I think, Missouri, Kansas City at home by 14. Had another bad loss in there to someone. I'm thinking for those three teams, I'm not seeing a lot of ray of hope at the moment, Blake.
Georgia's getting better, and I think that's all you can ask for. Whereas the other teams, I feel like, are going in reverse. I think Georgia's getting better. I don't know what that's going to mean with a SEC schedule. I don't think it's going to matter a whole lot, but I will say that they're at least they're playing better. And I mean that accounts for something. And really, when you look at Georgia's season, they're not better. I mean, again, we thought they'd be the worst team, but they've played not great teams, but they played some decent competition, and they've lost a lot of those games, close type games. Like they've at least been in the conversation. Whereas they're not really just getting blown out or anything. So I think you do have to give, Georgia a little bit of credit for that. That's why I think when I moved them up, I think they're 13th now. It's not like they've jumped a whole lot. I've got Missouri at 14, but I do think there is something to that, in that they are at least showing some signs of, development. And I think that, maybe that pays off for them, because it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks, I think, for Georgia, because when you look at the rest of their non-conference schedule, they've got George Mason, Western Carolina, East Tennessee State, and Gardner-Webb. I mean, could they win all four of those? Yes. Do I expect them to win all four? Maybe not, just because, I don't know which team gets them, but it's kind of one of those things where you just never know with a team like this. But let's say they do win all four of those games. I think that would continue to show that there is at least development happening there. And then I think maybe you're not changing your stance on Georgia being a NCAA tournament team or anything, but maybe you start to look at them, going into SEC play as a team that, all right, if they just keep getting better, maybe they're one of those teams that probably pulls off an upset or two down the stretch somewhere, and maybe nothing more than that. But I will give credit to Georgia for that, because I don't necessarily feel that way about Missouri or Vanderbilt right now. I feel like that they are doing things that's perhaps setting them in the wrong direction, whereas Georgia, I think, is doing some things that are at least got them heading in the right direction.
Well, one thing we haven't really talked about with Georgia is experience. And you got a couple of sixth-year guys in Jalen Ingram and Aaron Cook. And by the way, did career paths get stranger than Aaron Cook? He was at Southern Illinois where he was a really good player. Spends last year at Gonzaga and now at Georgia. Figure that one out for me. But they do have something that a lot of teams don't have, although it's not maybe cohesiveness at this point because these guys are still learning to play together. They got a lot of guys who've played a lot of basketball at least.
Yeah, and that always amounts to something when you're trying to build chemistry with we say it and like maybe sometimes we're exaggerating, but like this is a completely new roster. Like that's it. Like it's just a whole new roster. And that's, like I said, that's never an easy thing to do like it's completely different. Like this is it. Like this is just a completely different unit that he's working with here. And so I think that I'm not saying, like I mentioned, I'm not saying that this is going to be a team that, we're going to look up and just be wowed by come January or anything. But I do think that I have been more surprised that maybe that they are starting to make some of this development. And, even beating a team like Memphis, we know Memphis is struggling. They're a mess, but I still think that there's something to that for Georgia. And maybe that's something they can build on here moving forward.
What do you make of Vanderbilt? Because the Commodores have, I think, lost 3 of their last 4. They have not beaten a good team on the schedule. Again, you've got to note the absence of Liam Robbins and Rodney Chapman. But here's the weird thing about them, Blake. I think that the offense for Vanderbilt has been awful. Scottie Pippen Jr. is not getting a lot of help. Like the way their season's going, but what's your take on things?
I think it's Scottie Pippen's not getting a lot of help. And last year, we had Dylan DeSue and Jordan Wright, you kind of look at the numbers and they're there and that's been something, but it's just, it's the same scenario I think that's played out here. And that if we thought they were going to be deeper and have more depth, maybe they have more players that can play, but that doesn't always equate to good depth. And I just think that maybe we're starting to see that, especially against better teams and teams that, just have some of those difference makers that can outweigh just one guy that can take over a game the way that Scottie Pippen can. But it is also important to note what you noted, and that is they are playing probably without what we thought were going to be their second and third best players, perhaps. And so it's hard to know. It's hard, I think, just make a projection on Vanderbilt until we see those guys on the floor, because I do think they are difference makers, and we called them difference makers going into the season. So until that happens, you're basically looking at a team that you're going to have these games like you've seen in some of these where things just can swing so quickly. Of course, the SMU game is the biggest example of that. But I just think that's it. I think you're going to see this with them until those two guys are on the floor. Then I think maybe, then we reform our opinion on what Vanderbilt is. I think for now, though, they're kind of what you would expect them to be, still with one guy having to do not everything, but a lot, especially on the offensive side. And that is not turning into a good, I think, scenario for them right now.
Any parting thoughts before we end the podcast today on either something we didn't discuss or maybe some games ahead, which we've got plenty of good ones in the next few weeks, it seems?
Yeah, Alabama and Memphis looked a lot better a month ago. Alabama could run them off the floor at this rate with how Memphis has been playing, especially on offense. That's notable. If we talked about Kentucky, Ohio State, that's a big game for Kentucky. Missouri. We didn't talk a lot about them, but my goodness, if you look at Missouri's upcoming schedule, they just lost that game at Kansas. Now they get Utah, Illinois, Kentucky, Mississippi State, Alabama, Arkansas. Like Missouri, it's just going to be a long season for them. But
they don't have a sub 100 Ken Pom team on the schedule, or excuse me, above Ken Pom team on the schedule until Georgia last game of the year.
Yeah, they played a strong schedule last year too, but like this is one of those schedules too that's like, well, this should also feel like it's meant for that team last year that had all that experience, because this one's just not. It's not meshing well, I think, to this point. But yeah, that's kind of it. I'm curious to see, as we talked about, what Auburn looks like when Flanagan comes back. LSU, can they keep up this defense, which there's no reason to think they can't at this point. And then, I think the two teams, where they go from here, to me, are Florida and Arkansas. What do they look like over the next several weeks? We mentioned with Arkansas, they actually could look fine because of their schedule. But I think those two teams are still kind of wild cards to me in which direction they go in.
All right, Blake. Looking forward to covering some SEC hoops coming up here as we are still juggling between football and basketball. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel. That's under the 14. Check out our website. That's southeastern14.com. And follow us on Twitter. That's at 14 Southeastern. He's Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee. Thanks for listening to our show today. We'll be back with more podcasts to come in the next few weeks.